Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is show you how to get Blender installed on your computer. And then I'm going to go ahead and show you around Blender's interface so that you can get an idea of how to start using it. These interface elements are something that you're going to be more comfortable with the more you use it. Don't try to worry about what everything does right out of the box. So let's go ahead and open up Firefox or whatever your browser is, and let's go to blender.org. Okay, so blender.org's homepage here has the current version of Blender right in the header, and then you have the download button. Let's go ahead and click on download. So at the time of this recording, 4.2.1 LTS is the latest one. So it auto detects your operating system. Let's go ahead and download this. And then I'm not going to install it, but essentially once it's downloaded, you can go through the normal application installation process. After that, go ahead and open up Blender. Okay, so here we are in Blender, and I'll just walk you through the interface. So at the top, we have our typical software menu. So file, edit, file, new, open recent, save are going to be your primary commands. And then edit preferences is where you're going to kind of adjust the software as you might need to work better with your computer. So typically system, and then you want to enable whatever your graphics card might be. You can enable that here if it's supported. I'm just going to close preferences. So that is preferences, but just moving along the top, we can see that there are standard layout tabs. And so if you need to work in a particular process, let's say UV editing, it gives us a nice layout configuration for that. If you need to adjust the layout, I'll just show you one of the things that I struggled with when I first started learning Blender. I ended up, instead of scaling the panel, I ended up opening a new menu, or opening a new panel. So to do this on purpose, you would click on the inside corner, drag out, and you can have these new panels created. To get rid of them, you go to the outside of that corner and drag in, and that will collapse that panel in. And it kind of darkens it and then gives you this arrow showing you where you're going. So you can actually collapse in either direction once you do that. Okay, so what we have here in the middle is our 3D viewport. We'll be doing most of our work in the 3D viewport. To change this, you would click on the icon and you can choose another type of panel. All the panels are the same in that you can configure them to be different panels. Just clicking on this drop-down icon on each panel. Okay, so on the left we have tools in our 3D viewport. We can press T to hide or show those. Depending on the different layouts, that might be hidden by default. On the right-hand side of our viewport, we have some icons that help us navigate or enter into our render camera. We have a gimbal at the top. So if I click and drag, I can actually rotate around that gimbal. Let's turn on screencast keys. So you won't have this because I have this enabled, but essentially you should be able to see what I'm doing on the bottom left here in terms of keyboard and mouse. Okay, so if I click on the magnifying glass, I'll zoom in and out as I drag. The hand will kind of pan us around. If I click on the camera, that's going to take us into our render camera, which you can see here on the right in our outliner. And as we tumble around the scene, so if I click and drag on that gimbal to tumble, you can see that it's popped us out of our render camera. So if you click on the lock, it will essentially keep that render camera active and allow us to position our render camera. So it's actually moving our render camera in 3D space and orienting it to look at the cube. So if you're not sure what that means, I'm going to pop us out of our render camera, and so our render camera is here, and you can kind of move that camera around space, and depending on where it's positioned and what it's looking at is what it will see. Okay, so that's the render camera. And what about just, not using these icons? If you have a 3-button mouse, and you should have a 3-button mouse for serious 3D work, if you middle mouse click on your scroll wheel, typically, that will allow you to tumble. If you hold Shift down on the keyboard, middle mouse click, that will allow you to drag. And zooming, scrolling the wheel up and down will zoom in and out. So you want to practice, Shift clicking versus clicking versus zooming. That's going to allow you to really efficiently move around your scene. Okay. Along the top here, we have object mode. So if we select an object like our default cube and we go into edit mode, that will allow us to manipulate parts of this object. So if I go and start using some of the tools, you can see it's allowing us to actually modify our polygons. And now our object is no longer a cube. So I'm going to undo that. Command Z to undo doesn't always work because the software is so complex. If you do an operation over here and then you use a tool over here, it doesn't always know that it can undo across tools. So don't rely on the undo quick key. Certainly don't go to edit undo. Press Command Z or Control Z or whatever it might be on your computer. Try to use the key commands whenever possible. That's going to allow you to be really efficient with your time using the software. There are just so many tools that to use the menu items and the icons for everything will take you forever. So if, let's say, you want to know the quick key for moving, if you hover over that icon, it will pop up a tooltip and it will show you that Shift, Spacebar, or the G key will allow you to move an item. So if I select the item, if I do Shift Spacebar, I can then click on Move. Or I can select the item or the object here and then press G, and that will put me right into move mode. It doesn't give me those axes visually, but they're still there. So if I want to constrain this movement to the Z axis up and down, I can press Z on the keyboard. If I want it to be constrained to Y or X, I can press Y or X, and it will just change as long as the tool is active. Press Escape to exit out of this. Okay, so the other way I can do the same thing, if I press G to move, I'm in sort of free move mode here, and I want to constrain it to an axis. I can also use middle mouse click. So I clicked down on that scroll wheel, and now it's constrained to this one. I can click and drag again in the direction of the other axes, and it will change the constraints to those axes. So really handy to be able to do that while you're working. Press Escape to cancel. Okay, so that's move. We have rotation and scale. I'm not going to go through each of the tools in detail right now. We're just getting acquainted with the interface. So across the top, we have our menu items for the 3D viewport. Okay, so we have view. We can do something useful like frame selected. And if I do view frame selected, that will zoom me in to the selected object. So let's say I'm way over here and I'm lost in 3D space. I can go view frame selected and it will jump me back to my selected object. Let's say you're lost in 3D space, you don't know where you are or how to get back, and nothing is selected. Well, luckily we have our outliner. And so if I click on our cube, it's now selected. And if I do view frame selected, now it popped us back. So you can always get back to where your objects are using that method. Okay, so we can use the select menu for all these select options. I'm not going to go through. It would take hours to show you each tool in the interface. Adding is for adding objects to the 3D viewport or the scene itself. So let's add another cube. If I press G, I can move that cube over here. You can see in the outliner it's added cube.001. Always rename your objects if you need to. I actually don't need to in this case because it's not going to become anything. So cube, I might rename this to be cube 2 or something. But for my purposes of the demo, we don't need that cube. Okay, I can add lights. I can add images as references or backgrounds. I can add empty objects that are essentially just handles for things. I can add an armature, which is going to be a rig for deforming and animating a character. I can add text. So let's just press it. If you want to delete something from the scene, if you press X, that will bring up the delete menu, and then you can just hit delete. It's not the delete key, which you might think I'm pressing it now, it's not doing anything. It is the X key, so just keep that in mind. Very different than other software. Although we have on a full keyboard a forward delete key, and because I have forward delete, that actually does map to the X key. So just keep in mind, if you do have a full keyboard layout, your forward delete key might just be a good option for you to use. All right, so the other menu item is object. This allows you to do all sorts of things with whatever object is selected. So I can transform, rotate, scale. It just brings me into those modes. So now I'm in these modes based on selecting it here in the transform menu. I'm not going to go over all of these. Again, it would take hours. So the other box here that has our orientations for transforming, it's set to global right now. So if we change that to local, normal, gimbal, that'll change the orientation of whatever we have active. So if we have, let's say the move tool is active right now, and let's say my object is rotated. I just pressed the R key, by the way, to rotate, but you can come into rotate and do that manually the slow way, but you can do it. What you'll see is this interface, or these handles, are an orientation to the scene itself. I can change that to be locally oriented, meaning local to the object. And now I can rotate that specific to where the object is facing. Normal is specific to the normal direction of a particular face. So that's not as important in object view or object mode, but if we go to edit mode and we have, let's say a rotated, let's say this isn't a cube anymore. This face is kind of pointing its own direction compared to these other ones. If we go to normal, now it will orient our move tool with respect to where it's facing. So that can be really useful. Okay. If I want to zero these back out, so I have all these kind of transforms now made, but how do you know what exactly is transformed and how much? So on the right hand side, there is a hidden menu. N on the keyboard will toggle this open and close. This is super important. If we go up to item, we have our transform attributes for location, rotation, scale, and some other things. I can zero these out by clicking, dragging, and pressing 0. Or on the object with it selected, I can press Option, let's say R for rotation. All right, so I held Option and hit R. Scale, we have no scale, but if I scale this up, we can see it's now different from 111. Scale of 0 would be basically the tiniest object in the universe. So you can't have a scale of 0, or nor would you want one. Scale of 1 is sort of the correct size of the object, right? It's 100% of its scale. So right now, a scale of 3 would be 300% of its normal size. So let's say this is not what we want. We want this to be back to 111. I can do Option S, and now it will reset our scale back to 1 here in the properties. I'll talk more about scale and how you might be able to work with this while you're UV editing. You always want this to be 111 when you're doing UV editing, like the texturing workflow, that's not going to be helpful if this is scaled in all sorts of ways. Okay, it won't be predictable. So just keep that in mind. 111 is needed for doing other things with your object. So if this is scaled to look like this type of object, and this is the object you actually want, you don't want a cube, you want this flat object, you can apply the scale. So Control A on my keyboard, or if we go to Object Apply, so it's, Command A or Control A on my keyboard. It might be something different on yours, but if you go to Scale, now it will apply that scale, meaning it will reset the position of those vertices to be permanent, and now the scale is 111. Now I can texture this object. Okay, so let's move along. If I want to be able to work with different tools, I have to also be conscious of the pivot point, which is this orange dot in the middle. I can move the pivot point. I can go over here to Options. I can click on Origin, which is the same as pivot point in this case, and I can press G. I'm sorry, I didn't have the object selected. If I select the object, press G, I can move that origin point for that object. And now I can use the origin as the pivot point. So if I can use origin, click on this, and I can we have to get out of origin transform, turn that off. And now when I rotate, it's gonna rotate with respect around this origin. If you want to reset that, you can go to Object, Set Origin, Origin to Geometry, or you can do Geometry to Origin. Obviously, they're going to do different things. Geometry to Origin will move that down to that new setting, or I can move the origin to the geometry. Basically, it calculates where the center would be, and it moves it. If you go in and you do a bunch of editing, like I showed briefly, at some point you might find your whole object moved off the origin point. And so that's why you might want to reset that later. Okay. So snapping, this is the snapping menu. I'm not going to go through these now, but just know that snapping is going to be super useful if you need to take this object and let's say we have another one. Let's duplicate, Shift D to duplicate, and G to move. I can snap to the vertices. I can snap to edges, right? So it's just constraining the movement to that edge, right? Faces, same thing. And so forth. We can snap to grid points so that we can get nice, predictable movements. So I'm going to turn off snapping, but snapping is very configurable to help you accomplish what you need to accomplish. Okay, the next one is really cool. Let's do subdivide. Go into edit mode, right click, subdivide. And I'm just adding some extra vertices on this object. So you can see now it's got a bunch. If I go up to proportional edit mode and I turn this on, and these are different curves that will affect the fall off, but effectively I can move this and scroll up on my mouse and I can change the influence of that curve. Right now I can start to model that object just by moving one vertice. If I change this, it will have a different kind of effect on the other ones as you move it around in terms of that kind of fall off of movement. So that's proportional edit. If you ever find that you're having trouble moving just one object and you're like, why are all the other objects moving with my object? Just remember to turn off proportional edit. That can be very confusing if that's turned on. Okay. Moving along, so we have different visibility selection toggles, so you can make things selectable or visible based on this. We can hide all the viewport gizmos with one button or just choose individual ones. We can hide all the viewport overlays that are there to help us understand where we are in 3D space and what's visible. A useful one for when you're in solid view. So these circles here represent different shader views. So I can be in wireframe, solid, texture. So now we have white here because our object has got a white material on it by default. Or we can be in render view, and this will actually give you a preview of what it will look like when you render. Solid view is great for modeling and working with objects. Texturing, you have to be in a texture view to see any color or texture. If you're in solid view and you're saying, hey, why isn't my color showing up? Just switch to texture or rendered view. And another one that's really important for working with models and modeling is X-ray view. So with X-ray view, I can see through my object. If I go to edit view, edit mode, now I can select vertices that are on the other side that are not usually visible. So if I drag and select everything, I can grab these vertices in the back that aren't visible usually. But if I turn off X-ray and I click and drag, now it's not selecting that vertice. And that's because X-ray mode is not turned on. You can only select visible vertices with the select tool. If you just press A on the keyboard, that will select everything. Option A, deselect. So I'm going to press Tab to go back to object mode. All right. You can configure default lighting for each mode separately. Don't worry too much about that. At this point, you'll not really mess with that too much until you start rendering, or if you have very specific needs for your project. Okay, the outliner is over here on the right. It uses collections to keep things organized. So if I make a new collection, I can drag and drop that into the scene. I can call this objects, and then I can move my cube into that collection. I can make one for lights, and I can just, and then I can make one for cameras, and then I can move my camera in there. And now I can keep it nice and organized that way if I want to. Collections also allow you to do certain operations in Blender with the group of things that are in there. So it's kind of a way of tagging all the items for use later as well if you need. You can search through the outliner. For instance, if I want to just see my cube, if I have hundreds of objects, it's going to take me a while to scroll through that versus just typing in that object and filtering it down. Clear that out to see all the rest of your objects. On the right-hand side, we have our visibility toggles. So in the 3D viewport, I can turn off visibility with the eyeball. And I can turn off its ability to be rendered with the render icon. I can also, if I add a button, if I go to this filter menu and turn on the selectable icon, now I can make this object selectable or not. That's useful if I have a ground plane. So I did Shift A to add, and then I selected that plane. All right, so if I want to just select all of my objects here, bring that up. But I don't want to select the ground plane every time I'm selecting them. I can deselect the selectable icon. And now when I select, I can't select that ground plane and I won't accidentally delete it or move it or whatever. So let's get rid of that. Okay. All right, so below the outliner is our properties panel. So these are properties for the scene itself and your objects. So if I select an object, then I have these properties available down here. If I deselect it, it's not going to have any properties for it. So for instance, if I add a modifier, let's say I want to do a bevel modifier on this object, if I deselect that object, it does keep the last selected object active, but if I select another one and deselect, right, we're not seeing this object properties appear because it's not selected. Select it, now they're there. I'm going to remove that. So the modifiers tab is going to be useful for adding generative modifiers, deformations, all sorts of things to help you produce your models or achieve certain effects. Particles, you really won't be working with particle systems if you're looking at this video because you're already very well acquainted with Blender. So I'm not going to go over these physics constraints. These are advanced. You have your data properties here, which keeps your vertex groups. So a vertex group is a selection of vertices, and I can create a new group. I can assign these selected vertices to that group. I can deselect. I can select. Right now I have those vertices in that group. I can call this edge. And that might be useful if you, let's say, want to add a bevel modifier, but you just want it on this edge. Now we can go here to vertex group and I can select my edge vertex group. And now I can just control the application of this modifier to be on these two vertices. Right? Fun. Okay. Let's get rid of that and let's just move down. Arguably the most used and most popular one that you will start with is Material tab. And in the material settings, you can change color. We're not seeing anything because we're in the wrong view. So if I go to Texture View, now we can see that color change, or Render View. Texture View is going to be a nice preview where you don't have to worry about lighting and you can just see the changes happen quickly. I can make it metal. I can make it shiny by turning roughness down. I can turn roughness up and make it super matte. There are tons of other settings, but just keep in mind this is only for the principled BSDF that's on by default. You have access to all these other shaders that are for specific goals. Like we have one specifically for glass. If I want to make an object a light bulb, I can use an emission shader. I'm not going to go over how shaders work right now, but just know that the Materials tab is how you can remove and add new materials. Okay. If you want to add a material that's already in the scene, we have all of the scene materials here under this icon. So I can go ahead and grab that red material we configured. I can go to this new material that I created. So if you want to add multiple materials to an object, you can add more slots. So these are just empty slots that I'm adding to our object. And I can click on one of the slots and I can make a new material. You're not going to see this material because it's not applied to any of the faces. So what does that mean? It means that this material 1 is applied to the entire object. Material 2 is not. If you want to apply it, you have to go to edit mode and you'll see that these items now, these menu items pop up, and now I can grab some vertices, I can select material 2, I can assign it. Actually, we probably want a face. So let's grab a face, assign. Oh, sorry, let's go to 2, assign it. There we go. Now we see that I have both materials, but only the blue material appears on that assigned face. This isn't really going to impact a ton of your texture work because your textures will more properly control the application of these. But just know that you can apply materials to faces, okay? And you can do it as much or as little as you want. And if you want to remove them, you can just do this and kind of remove them from your object. All right, and then down here we have our texture properties panel. We can make textures. I'm not going to go over this at the moment, but just know that this is here for when you do work with textures in Blender. Okay, at the bottom of our default layout is our timeline. I'm going to drag this up. This has all of our keyframes. When we press the space bar, nothing happens even though it's playing all of our different frames. And that's because a keyframe essentially looks at when our object has changes made to it. None of our objects change. So if I went to frame 78 and I moved our object and then I went back to frame 0, it's not going to represent that change because, or the original state, because I don't have a keyframe set. So these frames store keyframes. So if I go back, I can add a keyframe by pressing the I key, and then I can go to frame 0. I can press G to move that, and then I can press I again to add a keyframe. And now you can see that Blender basically records those changes on those keyframes, and now it can interpolate, and now we have animation. So this timeline is a way to track, modify, store, delete keyframes. If we open up the side here, we have a hidden panel that if we do have keyframes, it will show you what they are on your selected object. So this one has none, so nothing appears. This one does have some, so it shows you what is keyframed, and you can select those, delete them, whatever you need. So I'm going to just select all of these and hit delete, or the X key will do the same thing. The backspace or delete key doesn't work. The forward delete or the X key will work. All right, so that is a really super fast introduction to the 3D viewport, the outliner, the properties panel. We didn't go over scene properties yet. Maybe I'll do that quickly. The top tab here is the tool icon. That's actually just settings for whatever active tool you have. So a move tool has these properties available. If I go to the select tool, it has different properties. The annotations tool has different properties. So let's go down here to the scene settings. So now we have access to our render engine. So in rendered view, this is where your render engine you'll see differences between these render engines. So if I go to cycles, this will render differently depending on what render engine I have selected. So this is what it looks like in cycles. It's a physically based render engine, which calculates light bounce and all sorts of things that make it the best quality. Eevee is more of a game render engine, so it doesn't look as good. You can configure it to be nicer, but it's more of a game engine type of thing. So cycles is probably what you're going to be working in most of the time to get the nicest results. But we get really nice shadows. It's actually, you can see this graininess, it's still rendering, it's resolving. You can see in the top left when rendering is done. And you can control the quality of the viewport render by actually coming down to viewport sampling underneath the render engine, and you can configure that. This is going to be dependent upon the graphics card you have in your computer for how, or the CPU that you have. So if we switch this to GPU compute, on a Mac it's going to do some initial loading, so nothing's going to happen until it ends up loading everything. It says it may take a few minutes for the first time in this message. So if you're on a Mac and you switch to GPU compute, which you should always do, once it loads, it'll go quickly. So we're just going to wait for that to load here. Interesting. It usually doesn't take this long. So I'm just going to continue going down while it loads the 3D viewport there. Okay, so it's done. But basically, this should resolve much quicker because I'm using a graphics card and not the CPU to do those calculations. Okay, so we have all sorts of advanced settings. If you want your background to be transparent, for instance, you can actually turn on transparency under the film option. What that means is, either you have a gray background, or if we do render image from the top here, you can see that it's transparent in the background. So if you save this out, it has transparency. Versus, let's render that image again. Now we have gray in the background, right? And that's because our scene has a default gray background. I can add our plane back in there. Let's just orient our camera. Okay, now when I render, actually, because I have an object in here, it doesn't matter if I have transparency on or not, because that gray background won't be visible because this plane is obscuring it. But we can just render this, and you'll see it's going to render based on your render settings. So this is where you would configure those render settings. I'm not going to go over that right now. Let's just go down here quickly. View layers, these are more advanced if you want to have tight control over the type of things that get rendered out of Blender. And that's going to be if you're doing compositing and advanced visual effects. So you would turn those on here. Scene settings, you can control some of the global gravity settings and simulation, quality, things like that. That's going to happen here in scene settings. You won't really go into here too much at the beginning. And then the world settings, you can change the background color if you want. You can do that through other means in the shading editor as well. I'm not going to go over the shading editor, but essentially the shading editor allows you to have more tight control over how you configure the materials and textures, and you have an option to change the world settings as well. So you can get rid of this background if you want. Let's go into render view here so we can see a better representation. I can add let's add a sky. So I can add a sky instead of the background. And now the scene is going to be lit because I'm editing the world material properties essentially. So again, this is going to be something I go over in a lot more detail later, but at this point, that's kind of that's what everything does on the initial interface. So, practice navigating and get comfortable with going into edit mode and object mode and selecting items, and transformations, things like that. And that's going to help you get comfortable using the software. The only last thing I'll say, just try to start practicing, remembering the shortcut keys for everything. You will be able to accomplish your work so much faster. Okay, so that's it for quick introduction to Blender's interface and some of its tools.